Alright, so for the last lecture of the week, we have 3 new terms on the board. We're going to talk about the relationship between text, in quotation marks, because we're referring to things that signify cultural meaning, in relation to subtext and context, as a way of engaging these different meanings of production, identity, consumption, regulation, and representation. So, if we're thinking about the relationship between race and popular culture, we can understand the racialization of these specific material objects as all dependent on context. So, for example, looking at Sunaina Myra's piece, we're thinking about, on the one hand, participating in cultural traditions without the actual people involved, and on the other hand, forms of consumption that erases histories and people, but we have the product itself. This is often the case of what happens through, for example, foods and modes of dances. We take the practice, but we refuse the people. So in this way, we then get this complicated context, for example, talking about globalization. So if we're talking about Indo-Chic, Sunaina Myra is looking at this period at which, yes, there are more South Asian immigrants coming to America, but what's really taking place is this stir in the media over the rise of South Asia as the place to export production as part of globalization. So through this media fervor, there then becomes this fascination with South Asian cultures without having that same fascination with South Asian people. If we look at Shibuya's piece, pages 147 through 149 talk about the symbolism of the car and how the lowrider takes on these very specific types of stylistic meanings where aesthetic choices reflect difference. There is no absolute meaning to a lowrider car except for the way that it gets placed in this larger cultural context. For example, Shibuya talks about the ways in which the American dream and the American image of the suburban family has depended upon this mode of having a vehicle and participating in that mode of production and consumption. If we look at Puerto Rican Barbie, on page 41, Negron Mutaner talks about the effect of context on the significance given to this object of self-representation. So we can see how the conflict between Puerto Rican American communities and Puerto Rican communities with Mattel's Puerto Rican Barbie really depends on these other histories of racial difference. So we can think about how, in the Puerto Rican context, the skin tone and the hair texture reflect this particular history of racial hierarchy. Whereas within the US, Puerto Rican American identity takes on a very different mode of reception because of the ways in which it has been racialized and how it has been talked about in the United States as opposed to Puerto Rico. And there we get these 2 different meanings that reflect these 2 different identities. We can also think about the racialization of material objects as a subtext. So for example, here, we're in Campbell's piece talking about US-Mexico consumption practices, we get this warning against assuming, as we talked about last time, ontological difference based on consumption patterns. While he claims to be looking at this unique sort of border culture, he doesn't want it to become essentialized and assumed that it is this thing. Instead, he wants us to think about it as a particular type of subtext. And back to Shibuya's piece, on page 165, we begin to talk about the leaf blower debates in Los Angeles. We see how the leaf blower takes on this very classed and racialized meaning that's never really brought to the fore. And in fact, maybe some of the celebrities weren't being overtly racist when they were lambasting against the leaf blower interrupting their quality of life. But we can see how race emerges as this type of subtext because it ends up being targeted at a very specific group of people. So one of the ways to think about this relationship of text, subtext, and context is also to take an intersectional approach, not just thinking about race and ethnicity, but other modes of difference. So if we look, for example, at race and class, if we're talking about Puerto Rican Barbie, we can think about Puerto Rican Barbie not just as a distinctly racialized object, but also as a distinctly classed object through the material construction of Hibaro identity. So talking about the different accessories that actually don't relate to the folkloric image of the Hibaro, but instead become activated through the ways that Puerto Rican Barbie is represented. So we see how class becomes added onto culture. Or if we look back at Shibuya's piece, on page 162, he talks about the lowriders and how there's this sort of crossover success where the distinctly popular culture lowrider becomes a part of this high aesthetic culture. On the one hand, through becoming a vehicle for public service announcements, and on the other hand, through becoming this sort of high art practice. So we can then think about this relationship back again to popular culture and high culture, and what happens when things cross that line as a distinct effect of racialized and class difference. We can also think about the subtext of gender difference that runs throughout these different analyses of popular objects. For example, cars, Barbies, and the South Asian cultural traditions in question, those are all distinctly gendered objects. So it asks us to think about the different ways in which there's not just race and ethnicity happening, but also gender difference being constructed through these culturally specific ways. One thing I want to point our attention to in talking about television last week is that many of us bumped up against this, is it better to have bad representations or not to have representations at all? This then signals the implied whiteness of what we mean when we talk about US popular culture. And I don't use the term whiteness to say, damn you all white folk, but instead to think about the specific histories through which these popular forms and these popular forms of consumption come out of. So if we're thinking about television, we are thinking about how television, starting in the 1950s, has been very marketed as a classed and racialized object. Classed in terms of the suburban family and racialized in terms of whiteness. We can also think about how this implied whiteness plays off of Orientalism and tropicalization, which is why I want us to make a space within our definition of authenticity for Asian Pacific Americans and US Latinas and Latinos. Authenticity not always referring to something happening somewhere else, but things that also happen here. So if we're thinking about the relationship between text, context, and subtext in relation to Asian Pacific Americanness and US versions of Latinidad, we're thinking not just about these cultures that take place somewhere else, but also thinking about how it brushes up against, becomes a part of, or contests what's in US popular culture. So for example, if we look at Fan Ono's piece on t-shirt rhetoric, we can understand Asian American rhetoric as both subjectivity and as subjectless critique if we look on page 183. And those of you coming from rhetoric and communications should really enjoy this piece because it speaks kind of your analytical language. So if we're thinking about this t-shirt rhetoric, it doesn't have anything to do with specific Asian cultures or ethnicities, but if we're looking at who's producing it, who's consuming it, and who's making these sorts of meanings out of this interconnectedness, we do see that it maps onto Asian Pacific Americans, and we can understand it as part of Asian Pacific American pan-ethnic culture. So this then relates to what Fan Ono on page 178 called double agency. On the one hand, a critique of symbolic racism that also claims a US identity and makes a sort of ambivalent space within US popular culture. So going back to accountability, once we start thinking about text, subtext, and context, I want us to think critically about who is being held accountable. Because, for example, in the discussion on television, there was much more talk about people getting offended as opposed to holding producers accountable for what's being put out there. So I want us to ask critical questions, not just holding Asian Pacific Americans or US Latinos accountable, but also thinking about people who are producing particular text, practices, and objects that are filled with cultural meaning. I also want us to open up a space where we can think about the American or the US on Asian Pacific American and US Latino, not just as a nicety, but as talking about this distinct form of producing material objects, practices, and text.